Hello, everyone, and welcome to the middle grade graphic panel. My name is Alea Perez. I'm the Youth Services Manager of the Roselle Public Library in the Chicago suburbs, and I'll be moderating this session. Today, we're going to be learning more about some spectacularly creative stories that include ghosts, superheroes, dragons, the fates, and real-life inspirations. I am so pleased to welcome all of our panelists. First, we'll be introducing Adrienne Kress, Jade Zhang, and Adrienne and Jade worked on Ghost Circus from Union Square Kids publisher. We're introducing Mike Kunkel. And Mike is a creator of Herobear and the Kid, The Inheritance by Mad Cave Studios. Introducing Sarah Mensinga, who is the creator of Kindred Dragons from Abrams. Introducing Dora Mitchell. And Dora is the creator of The Puzzling Fate of Millicent Graves from Little Brown and for young readers. And last but not least, introducing Daniel Miyares, How to Say Goodbye in Cuban from Random House Children's Books. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to dive in. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about all of your fabulous works. So we're just going to go straight to our stories, and I'll be directing this first question towards Adrienne, Jade, and Daniel in that order. So in the case of both of your stories, or all three of your stories, they deal with characters that are going through separation from loved ones as one of the main themes, and they face the uncertainty of reconnecting with those loved ones. Starting with Adrienne and Jade, can you kind of tell more about your story? What were the origins of it? And how did the two of you come together to create it?
That's all the questions. That's wonderful. First of all, just also thank you so much for having us, and we're very excited to be here. The origins, so I wrote the script, and then we had a bit of a matchmaking session to find each other. Interestingly enough, my friend Stephanie Cook, who is a comics editor and a writer in her own right, I reached out to her, and she sort of reached out to the wider world, talking about the themes of the book. And that's when Jade expressed an interest. And of all the people in all the land, first of all, Jade's the best. Second of all, she at the time happened to live literally around the corner from me. So across countries, it was meant to be. The story itself was, I like writing about stories where we as a society as a whole, what we sort of owe to each other, but in a really, intimate, fun, here's this character, here's that character. And with both Casey and Creepy Girl, who are the protagonists of Ghost Circus, they each sort of come at a situation from the polar opposite side. So Casey is completely confounded. He doesn't know why he can see dead people. He sees dead people. And he doesn't know why he is where he is. He doesn't know why his parents can't see him. He feels lonely and lost. He can't communicate with the two people who are closest to him. And he's terrified. And Creepy Girl, meanwhile, has just lived this sort of afterlife existence, just floating literally through it without really questioning it or wondering. So she's numb to all her feelings. So you've got Casey, who's crazy full of feelings, and Creepy Girl, who has none. And Casey's comes from fear and ignorance, and Creepy Girl's from not even thinking to ask the questions. And as they come together, they realize, oh, there are answers to these questions. It's not as scary as I thought. And she realizes, maybe I should be asking questions because maybe there's more going on than I thought. And then together they save the day. Also, I really wanted to write about a ghost circus. So that's sort of where that came in. But then Jade elevated the story to a whole other level with her art, and then with her own insights and her own point of view as well.
Yeah, well, yes, we don't need any reason to have a ghost story. I think that's just fun in itself. But Jade, can you speak a little bit about, what was it in the script that really called to you that made you think, yes, this is a project I should take on?
Yeah, so I am a horror fan myself. I have made my own horror comics in the past, and with Adrienne, with her own background writing for middle grade, I thought this is like a really good, like just a really good match for the two of us to work together. And I also just love the whimsy of the circus, just the visuals of it. I thought it was a really great setting for a graphic novel in particular. It's such a visual story. I wanted to just help bring it to life.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I think it rides that line for middle graders so nicely, where it does have that element of spookiness, of horror, but it's still very accessible. So, was there anything in the real world besides a natural gravitation towards ghost stories and horror that really inspired Casey and Creepy Girl specifically, or was that just you got into a vibe and that's where the story went?
I I think I got into a vibe. I think the idea of a ghost circus was really compelling. I was really interested in a lot of the themes. And then the question is, how do we get in there? Who's our point of view character? And, you know, do we want to do fish out of water, or do we want to do this is a life that somebody has lived and they're rediscovering it from the inside? And then I thought, why not both? So I wouldn't say that there was a direct outside influence for Casey and Creepy Girl, but I've written a lot of middle grades. This is my first graphic novel script, which is just, you can maybe sense my mania. I am so excited about this book. I'm so excited I got to do it. It was a learning curve, that's for sure. But I have tended over the years, I've written from various POVs, sometimes just a singular protagonist. I've really over the years fallen in love with the dual protagonist, because I think maybe, I hope this doesn't sound too whatever, but the duality within people, I feel like it's a way to explore more than one point of view, one way of looking at things. And so in this case, it was, well, who are the two? Why are there two? How do they balance each other, and how do they challenge each other? So they sort of came about because of what the story dictated in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I totally get what you mean by, the complexity of characters. You can do a lot with one character, but of course, double the fun, and there's more more to work with there. So thank you so much, Adrienne and Jade, for sharing a little bit about your story. We'll be coming back to you in a bit, but we're going to ask Daniel some questions. So Daniel, your story, of course, well, I say of course because I know and you know, but our audience doesn't yet. It's based on true events. And you mentioned in the author's notes that this was a project that took you almost 2 decades to summon the bravery, to use your own words, to create. Can you share a little bit more about, what the story is about, what was at the root of your hesitation, and what led you to moving forward with it?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here with all these amazing creators. I'm just enthralled by your stories. Thank you for sharing them. My story began almost like you mentioned, a couple of decades ago, over 20 years ago. I had moved out to Kansas City on my own for the first time for my first job out of college, and my dad called me in the middle of the night one night, which was kind of strange. But he was just calling to check up on me. It was like midnight, woke me up, and but in our conversation, in my half awake state, he shared with me for the first time these stories of how he escaped Cuba as a young boy. And I just had this sense, growing up, never heard these stories, never, I knew that they escaped Cuba at some point, but I just didn't know the story of it all. And he never really spent much time talking about it. So I got this sense in the moment, like, this is really important. I should be writing this down. And so I got these little notebooks and I just started filling them up while we were talking. We talked, for hours that night, and it just seemed too important not to document, because I had this sense that if I didn't do that, it would just kind of evaporate, those stories. And I was a young kid, fresh out of college. So, I didn't have a lot of time in my schedule to spend sitting, listening to elders talk about the good old days, but it just, at that moment, it's like, man, I gotta get this down. So anyway, I had these notebooks full of these stories. And so then after that, I would call him up periodically and just say, I was thinking about this thing that you said. Like, tell me more about that. And so I was playing reporter for many years, just kind of, fleshing out what happened and why, because it seemed so foreign to me. I grew up very suburban, and didn't really want for much. I had a pretty normal childhood as far as I can tell, and so it took about 20 years because, for one, it seemed too special. Like, it was something that I didn't. For one, I wasn't making books at the time, so I didn't really think like, I'm going to publish this story. But I knew it was important, and I wanted to do something with it so that it could be kept. And that's why I had all those notes. But I didn't have the courage to actually use it in a money making venture in that way, and I didn't know how, because I didn't have the experience. This is my first graphic novel ever, but I just didn't have the experience and understanding of how to even do it justice for many years. And then another hesitation is, I support my family with what I do, and so I just couldn't do all the work required to make it what it needed to be, for what I could earn or can even convince someone to give me to do it. And so the path forward wasn't clear until I got 20 plus books in making children's books and illustrating novels and things like that. I finally, through working with Ann Schwartz at Ann Schwartz Books, she took a chance on me and just said, "Hey, remember that story you told me about with your father? Like, let's do something with that. Are you interested?" And I was like, "Heck yes, Ann, let's do this." So yeah, it took a long time, but I think it was, for one, it was too precious, and I just didn't know how. I didn't understand how to do it justice.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to a lot of what I hear coming out of the comics industry, is, setting aside the closeness of that story, the personal side of that story. There's just a general need for support so that creators can take the time to do this, because you're pouring so much of your actual self into it, whether it's a true story like yours or fictional like everyone else's. Having the resources to tell your stories is something that I know from all of my years following graphics and graphic novels and comics, that there's just not enough time, money, to make it something feasible for y'all to do. So I appreciate that you're able to do that, because stories like all of yours today really need to be in the world. So thank you for that. Daniel, can you talk a little bit more too about what it feels like to have your story being released, in this current environment that we're all in, and whether or not you see any parallels to current events, whether or not that was, just timing of things? Like, how does all of that feel to you as the person who had collected your father's stories and put them into print?
Yeah, when I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, because this isn't necessarily the first time I've gotten this question, and I guess I would start by saying I'm really uncomfortable with how many parallels there are with the story and what's happening now. This is a story about essentially a family and how their lives are turned upside down by revolution, and the tough choices they have to make, and how those choices affect the children, everyone in the family, the extended family, and everyone, and just how they navigate it, especially from the perspective of my dad as a young boy. And for me, it's surreal to see it as a book kind of coming out, but also these parallels of there's the history of it. In the book, you'll notice there's chapter openers that give a little blurb about what's happening during the revolution, to kickstart each chapter, and then during the chapter, it's essentially the life of the family and what's happening with them. And so in that way, you see this individual, essentially Castro, methodically consolidating power, right? Taking these steps to consolidate power, and I think that's not the only time that's happened. Obviously, it's happening almost every day in this world at large. Individuals who have ambitions and they want to consolidate power for themselves, and the steps and the lengths they go to do that. And then for better or worse, whatever their intentions are. There's several conversations in the book about, what happens when someone has all that power. What do they do with it? Are you going to share it? Are you going to give it back to the people? What are you going to do with that? So that parallel is very much alive, and uncomfortably so in this country. I see things every day that make me, give me these flashbacks of all the research I was doing for this story. But also just how immigrants are used as political objects and not seen as people, and quote unquote othered so often. And I just hope that this book can be a conversation starter in that way too, because really at the root of it, it's a family who, like I said, they're just trying to do what's best for their kids and themselves, and live healthy and happy lives. And we lose sight of that for whatever reason. Maybe it's our own hurts or our own struggles take precedent over that, or it's some political alignment we have, or whatever it is, we other people. And to me, that's something that that is constantly going on and always has been, but we have to fight against that. And so I hope that the story kind of can help start conversations to break through those parallels on a road to a more empathetic place. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Daniel. And yeah, I saw some parallels between all of your stories that kind of deal with the struggle for being seen and valued as whole people, not just aspirations, not just interests, but whole individual recognition. So I really appreciated that was a theme throughout all of these stories, and it may take place in a more humorous way in some of our fictional stories, but something definitely that's a thread running through all of them. So I really appreciate you sharing more. We're going to be asking Sarah, Dora, and Mike some questions now. So with your stories, they all feature main characters who seem to live, these pretty average lives within the context of their setting. So it may be a fantastical setting, but they're still kids going through a pretty typical life. And then at some point, somehow, they uncover either roles or powers that they are given access to that allows them to go beyond what they may have thought possible for themselves within the context of their worlds. So some very, very fascinating situations that we find these characters in. So starting with you, Sarah, we have your character Alice, and you can share a little bit more about the overall arc of your story, but we see this character who seems so desperate to connect to a dragon, which are a main feature of your story. And she maintains this, steadfast hope that it's going to happen. She's preparing for it. She's getting ready for it, despite there being absolutely zero guarantees that it will happen for her. So can you share a little bit more about, how did this world that Alice even exists in come about? How did you imagine it?
Yeah, sure. And first of all, just say also thank you for having me here. And I'm really enjoying hearing everyone talk about their books because, working on graphic novels can be so lonely. So it's really fun to see other people who are doing the same thing. Yeah, so about the world. So I grew up in Toronto, Canada, and I was a teen tween in the 90s. And so there was a lot of it felt like all the Canadian content on TV was Lucy Maud Montgomery book related. Like it was Road to Avonlea or Anne of Green Gables, or so it almost felt like, coming of age in Atlantic Canada and a roughly dressed, in the turn of the century was its own genre. And so I always love the idea of taking types of stories that don't have magic or fantasy and then throwing some magic in them. And so when it sort of struck me that thinking of those type of stories as their own genre and then adding something like dragons was a really fun kind of combination and could give me a lot of sort of meaty stuff to work with depending on how I shape the story.
Excellent. Yeah, I really love that that's the, the root of the story. I feel like most 1900s folks are going to feel that very deeply. I hope the younger audience, I know the younger audience will too, but definitely a nod there to adults. But can you share a little bit more about, what inspired Alice in particular and her strong passion for becoming a kindred to a dragon?
Yeah, sure. So So I feel like there's a lot of stories and narratives in the middle grade space, and I love that there are that are basically about like, accomplishing a goal. So there's like obstacles in the way, and eventually the character will accomplish a goal. But I like find I'm very fascinated with characters who don't accomplish their goals, or are greatly disappointed, and how they deal with that. So like, this is a book where I think if a kid starts to read it, they're like, well, obviously Alice is eventually going to get a dragon, and that's not what happens, and she has to really, deal with this disappointment and really realize that, not getting what she wants doesn't mean like the end of the road, that there's other paths out there. And even as the book sort of concludes, like how she's trying to help this older dragon Brim. And, again, things don't quite end up the way she hopes at the end of the book either. And she again has to sort of pivot and realize that, her life has taken some unexpected turns, but it doesn't mean that's the end. Like and I think that can be a very hopeful message for kids as well.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I'm not going to spoil it for anyone, but I absolutely love the resolution of Alice's journey. I read it and I'm like over here pumping my arm going, yes. Couldn't have asked for a better way for her to get
Well,
things
honestly,
that would make her happy.
when I first started writing the story, I was going to end it in a more obvious way, but I was like, that just didn't feel satisfying. And so I was really happy that eventually, like, while I was working through the different drafts of the book, this idea came to me of a more unexpected ending. So I'm glad you liked it.
Yes, yes. I'm excited for young readers too, to see what we're talking about when they read this. So thank you so much, Sarah. Really appreciate hearing more about Alice and the dragons. Dora, so when looking at your story, we have the character of Millicent, and she isn't really longing for anything particularly out of the ordinary. And she, in fact, kind of seems really desperate for a life where there's just more structure and more what she might call normalcy. Um, and so we get a situation that's very far from that. Can you describe a little bit what your story is about, and where did the idea of puzzles as a control mechanism for the world around Millicent, where did that originate?
Yeah, so that was kind of the basis of the story. Really was the idea of wanting to write a story about a kid who is kind of the straight-laced type A organized person in their family, and kind of has the desire to reshape her family's personalities to be more in line with what she likes, which is let's do things the way they should be done, and with a lot of organization and structure. So so I knew I had that in the back of my mind, that I wanted to tell a story about a girl finding a way to control that. And like Sarah, I like stories that are basically set in the real world, but just with a twist and some magical elements. And so I knew that there would be some sort of magical way that she would have this kind of power that she could use and kind of run amok with, but I hadn't really thought about I couldn't come up with the right way for her to get that ability. But I was visiting a friend of mine who's an older woman who used to volunteer at the library where I work. And so I've, become friends with her. She's kind of a surrogate grandma of mine, turning 101 this year. And so she and I would spend just hours together doing jigsaw puzzles. And so I'd been visiting her, and just all of a sudden it hit me. I just had the image of this mysterious older woman as a neighbor with, this kind of spooky apartment full of magical jigsaw puzzles that would be, it just occurred to me a jigsaw puzzle would be a good way to symbolize someone's life and personality and aspects of who they are. So it just was one of those things that kind of came together after it sort of was simmering in my mind for a long time. And then as the story kind of developed, then it became like, okay, it's not just a neighbor who's maybe some sort of witch, but maybe there's 3 neighbors and they're actually the fates. And so it just happens that Millie sees jigsaw puzzles, but really it's just a symbol, and it's just that theme of things being more than what they appear on the surface sort of started to develop. And so then that's where the idea sort of started to grow, that the puzzles aren't really puzzles, they're whatever the individual perceives.
So as you worked with the character of Millicent, you know, you had this opportunity to show her gaining more control over things, or so she thought. But how does her having that access to more control, like more than the average person, how does that impact, you know, hers, others' destinies? How does it lead in general to less certainty and structure? And what do you think a young reader might take away from that, you know, from her desire to be so in control of everything?
Yeah, I like that question a lot because it made me think about that aspect of it. And it is kind of interesting that she's trying to take kind of ultimate control, but really trying to shift people's personalities and who people are and how that impacts the world is obviously going to actually create a lot of uncertainty. And as Millie discovers, that's not the way to have control. She's losing control rapidly. But she does kind of fight that and continues to try to, well, if I change this, I'll get it reined in, I'll get it back in control, and I'll change that. And so it is about her kind of exploring like having that much control and then kind of coming to understand that she can't have that level of control over people. So yeah, and then there's also the Morgan, Mrs. Morgan, who is her neighbor, mentions at one point a concept that's kind of central to me, which is if it wasn't supposed to happen, you wouldn't have been able to do it. So when Mrs. Morgan refuses to help Millie kind of fix this disaster she's created, she says, no, this is the way things are supposed to unfold. I can't step in. And so I thought that I just kind of wanted to introduce the idea that maybe Millie doesn't really have control in that way. It's still just the destiny that was written out for her was to do this. And so how much control does she really have? And then I think like the message that I was hoping would come through is I really wanted to write a protagonist who was just brave and bold and would do big things, even though it's obviously a big mistake and she makes a lot of mistakes. And I wanted to write a character who would kind of show not being afraid to try to take control over things, to try to shape your life, even if she goes a bit too far. And what I like about the way that plays out is that she owns up to making mistakes and it's taking the responsibility to fix the mistakes. That's kind of how she realizes just how much power she does have. So I hope that message comes through for kids.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dora. And I think, again, another, you know, recurring theme that we see between so many of these stories is that sense of, you know, exploration, discovery, that sense of figuring out where boundaries are for their own sense of control, learning that they may have more control than they understand. So really fascinating to see how all of these stories kind of play on that theme, but in their own very special ways. So really appreciate you bringing that up. All right, we're going to turn our attention to you, Mike. Thank you so much for your patience while we came around. But I'm really excited to talk to you about Herobear. So your story featuring Tyler and Herobear has existed in one shape or another for about 20 years now, and really introduces this fun mixture of, you know, superhero lore and this like grander cultural lore that we see at least in Western culture. So I'm really curious to hear, you know, what sparked their creation? What's made them such a lasting set of characters for you to work with?
Well, I will echo first everybody else's. I'm so honored to be here, and I'm fortunate to be the last one to hear everybody's great stories and hear what you're all working on. It inspires me. So one of my favorite phrases is iron sharpens iron. And so that really is at the core of Herobear as well, is that often two are better than one. And where that idea of what if your best friend was a superhero? And what would that be like? I'm a product of the 80s. TV and film shaped me, and culture shaped me. So when I think about that, movies like Stand By Me and A Christmas Story, the first person narrative, that nostalgic sort of look back on life and childhood. Uh, Stand By Me especially was a huge influence on me, and that those moments of narration, those moments of looking back, shape a lot of my storytelling. And so that sort of prompted me to look at childhood. And one of our phrases that came from Herobear and eventually became part of our company and what we do is remember your childhood and pass it on. And that concept drives Herobear, of this idea that this little kid inherits a stuffed bear from his grandpa, a beat up old stuffed bear and a broken pocket watch. But anytime he touches him on his nose, he becomes his best friend. And there's this unusualness to it that sparked a lot of story of like, what sort of adventures would you go on? You know, what sprung from that? It initially was me drawing as a kid. It's something I've wanted to do since, you know, for forever, is you know, tell my own stories and draw things. But looking back on it and those adventures in childhood sparked this friendship. And it's just sort of opened up a lot of different stories that I've wanted to do with it. And it has been an evolution of story as it's grown, you know, as I've been able to do it. I'm very fortunate to now do it in a even new form with Mad Cave and be able to launch it out in that way. And so it really has come from that concept of something that's relatable, which is childhood and those memories and those experiences that we have. And we all have different ones, but there's a lot of commonality in a lot of it of what we did as kids. And I always like taking something that's relatable and then add in a little bit of magic or a little bit of something special to it in that way, because it gives a nice entry point for everybody to kind of come to in that way. So what better than a 10-foot tall polar bear in a cape to put that in there. And I will say, and I was hoping I could find it, but initially it was the story of a superhero with a teddy bear sidekick. And I adjusted that a little bit more, and I was like, no, it should be about this kid. And even though it's Herobear and the kid, it really is Tyler's story. It's about Tyler looking back on things. But I have two pictures from when I was a kid that I'm from SoCal, so I went to the LA Zoo. And the only two pictures that I have from that are from the polar bear exhibit. So for those that don't know, Herobear is a giant polar bear. And that ties into so much more. But it was just funny that those are my only memory or my only existence of going to the zoo then. So anyway,
Oh, we
that's
should
a
all
little bit
be
of
so
what's driven it.
lucky.
I know. I'm a bit of a pack rat, so I have lots of things that I've held on to. So a little too much.
I think it's amazing, but also from the 80s and also pack rat in some emotional regard. So I can appreciate that. Mike, can you talk a little bit more about Tyler and Herobear? There's a lot about Tyler's family history that he's just completely unaware of. How does Herobear play a part in Tyler learning more about that history and coming to terms with it?
So it's a great point to kind of come at it. I always say that this first book is all about his inheritance. So I always say, through learning about Herobear, Tyler gets the what. What is his inheritance? What is it? And he'll learn a little bit more that Herobear actually knows a bit more history about his grandfather's history and why that they had some sort of previous connection to things. And so this first whole story is the what. The next book that comes after this is the why. So that's two sides of the coin of why he then gets it. And Herobear is core to all of that. The payoff is why Herobear is ultimately given to Tyler is a deeper story of Tyler's grandfather, who in the very beginning of the story starts with the funeral. It starts with Tyler losing his grandfather, and similar to Daniel, which I loved your story of hearing stories from your father. The idea of, we know these people in our lives, and it's always great to sort of dig a little deeper and go, what was your life like? I only knew you through one aspect. And so Tyler learns through Herobear and through a couple other characters more about his grandfather and who he was, and ultimately how it begins to shape him in that way. So that's really kind of the driving force of it in that way, is that idea of how does Herobear sort of come along Tyler at a time of his life where he's gone through some loss, he moves to a new town, there's a change in his life in that way, and how do you move forward with that? And always having that best friend with you is always good and always helps in those moments.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate
you.
it. So, kind of on that note of, life-changing moments, speaking now to Daniel and Dora and Mike in particular, your characters, Carlos, Millicent, Taylor, they're all experiencing in their own ways these rather notable life-changing events, whether it is the political turmoil happening all around them. In the case of Millicent, there are these actual physical rips in space and time. So, like, things have been really disturbed there. In the case of Tyler, we have the loss of grandparent, that subsequent move that you mentioned. So they're going through all of these big things. And for children, these things, even not on those genuinely grand scales, change in general can be big. So them facing all of that and also having everyday challenges that young people experience, trying to fit in at school, making it through the day, it's a lot for them to try to carry. So can you, we'll start with you, Daniel, kind of talk about what ways does this mirror the experiences that young readers might be facing in current time? So, trying to go through everyday life while this bigger turmoil is happening around them. And how do the similarities and differences, between your stories and what's happening in real life, how does that allow your characters or your readers rather to connect with your stories? So we'll start with you, Daniel.
Thank you. I mean, this is a very meaty question, and it gets right to the heart of the matter. Thank you, Alea. The idea of readers, and for me, starting out, like, deciding to even tell this story, big question I had to answer was how would I tell this story for a young reader and make it make sense or relevant to them in some way? Because it was super relevant to me because it had to do with my father and my family. But someone else, what does it mean to them? And I hope I hope readers can find relevance and connection in a lot of different ways. One, for most kids, hopefully this story feels like something very far away, and you're like being exposed to a different way that someone might have had to live their life that you didn't understand, like, so that you can maybe understand the world through someone else's eyes for a minute. Hopefully it's like that, but I have a feeling there's a lot of kids who are going to relate to the story because they might have actually gone through the similar experiences of leaving their home under duress and trying to make a new life somewhere. But at the same time, on the ground level, when I was processing this and talking to my dad, and in our conversations, it was clear to me that there are all these special moments that had nothing to do with the larger things that were going on, like how much it meant to him to ride horses with his grandfather. That was just so important to him above anything else. And so I wanted to make sure to take note of those things and look for the gaps, because obviously he had to say goodbye to friends several times, and what does that look like? And so there's several scenes in the book where his friend Alvaro, they're throwing the ball, they're playing catch, and as young kids might, but kind of letting the huge emotions of the moment of Carlos moving away or Alvaro moving away later kind of exist around the activity of throwing the ball, but not really hitting the nail on the head. Moments like that I think are really important because, for young kids trying to process all these big feelings, I just hope that they can look at it and say, I kind of feel that way. Like, I don't know what to say about what's happening or the fact that I'm moving or they're moving, but at the same time, it doesn't change the fact that it's happening, and it's going to be okay. So anyway, I try to build in a lot of moments like that because I hope that readers can connect with it on different levels, and kind of meet them where they're at, whatever they're bringing to the table. Because they're bringing their own hurts and experiences and joys, and just hopefully there'll be some connection point like that.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Dora.
Like Daniel said, this is such a meaty question. There's a lot to dig into there, and I guess I always feel like writing sort of more escapist adventure and fantasy and stuff like I do. It's hard to come after Daniel's amazing true life story, which has so many parallels to what's going on now. And but I do think, like, I'm sure all of us here believe that fantasy and fiction can help us work through things that maybe are too scary to face if you're a kid to look at it in a real life story. So hopefully then stories that are like, you know, we all have that doubt and fear and worry about the world around us. And yeah, Millie's facing it in a very tangible form through rips in the fabric of reality. And it's a little more than kids will have to face. But I hope that still, that seeing characters navigate situations like that, and seeing that you can face scary things and come through it, like Millie has to face at one point the largest rip in the fabric of reality. And since it's her fault, it's there, she has to face it directly and say, well, okay, I'm gonna go through it and come out the other side and see what I can do. And so hopefully that does help kids sort of see, like, you can face things that you think are bigger than you can do, and you can be okay.
Lovely. I really enjoy that that analogy there. Thank you so much for sharing, Dora. Mike.
Yeah, as I alluded to earlier, the idea that there's going to be loss, you know, that we're going to encounter that on a heavy, deeper level. That is what sparks a lot of the story. I invented, but it became part of our family, and I actually had someone come up later and say they adopted it into almost like a therapy thing for kids and for people. Is that when Tyler initially goes to the funeral for his grandfather, everybody's around and they don't know what to do or what to say quite. And his dad pulls out a dictionary, and they have a glass jar, and everybody goes through the dictionary and tears out a word and puts it in the jar of what his grandfather meant to them. And Tyler eventually chooses the word generous, unbeknownst to how much more that means on a deeper level. But it was a way to just sort of go, I don't know what to say. Here's a tool. Here's something you can do. And so if kids can read this and gain something from it on some level, how to process something in a different way like that, and that's on a deep level of loss. On the other side, I want to also highlight the fun of being a kid. You know, the things that you go through, the things that I remember, the childhood adventures of making a little fort in my grandfather's garden where he had these tall trees, and I sort of made it my little clubhouse in there, and he let me do it. And he goes, okay, you can just put it in there. And that was my little clubhouse. And riding bikes and going on adventures, and kids obviously have different experiences today, but at its core, it's still that opportunity to go, can I go on an adventure? Can I go have some life experience younger? And how does that shape me moving forward, you know, in that way? So a lot of those touchstones are what I'm hoping will connect with and have found their way to audiences on some level in that way, you know, both the good and the bad in our lives.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. And I think, again, that's something that you all did so well. Like, you don't see a complete stripping of joy. There are still those moments where they're making human connections, still, you know, relating to others. It's not all one bad experience. It's, you know, conflict, which we all experience in life. So I appreciate that true balance you've all presented. Our last question of the session, because we're getting close to time. My question is going to be directed towards Sarah, Jade, and Adrienne. So in the case of your stories, we have Casey, Creepy Girl, Alice, and they all find themselves pitted against individuals who want to either strip them of power, limit the power of those around them. And it seems to be out of either fear, desire for control, you know, these big emotions that we may not fully understand. And we see this with the ringmaster. We see this with the citizens who are trying to rally against dragons. We see, you know, this with things being banned from, or people or individuals being banned from taking up space in society. So starting with you, Sarah, you know, what do you think readers will draw connections to with these representations of oppression around them?
I'll go quick. I know we're running out of time. I love with world building when world building is built on like kind of a what if question. And so with the world of Kindred dragons, some young women will get dragon eggs that they then get to raise as their own kindred. But you know, I thought early on, I was like, maybe everyone should get dragon eggs. But I was like, you know, it's much more interesting if it just goes to women, because, you know, in our world, we women don't really randomly get a whole bunch of power. And I was like, you know, well, if that did happen, you know, how would people respond to having some women suddenly have this great power. And so I think in the story too, you see these women also have to manage their threat level a little bit, because the younger girls who have these baby dragons are very vulnerable. So I really created a really fun backdrop, even though that's not the main story, to sort of set the characters in that world and to see how they would interact.
Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate it. And yeah, I have to admit that completely escaped me that that was an intentionally done component. Like, it just made sense to me that this is how it should be. So I really appreciate you showing it in that light. All right, Jade. As much as you feel comfortable with, the illustrated side of things, what about the story and about that depiction of power and representation of oppression to the larger world do you think will connect with readers?
Uh, I think, well, it's like the circus, the flea in the end that was like controlling the entire circus, controlling the ghosts in the circus, was this huge reveal, this like unseen factor that was literally working underground, sort of subconsciously influencing all the ghosts and keeping them trapped in the circus, making them work for the flea, making him more powerful, is something that um is just really unexpected. There was a lot of like visually very scary characters and ghosts that were immediately a threat and immediately scary to the main character Casey. And in the end, it was the circus itself that was the actual villain that needed to be taken down. And I think that part of it is like something that really resonated with me and that I hope will resonate with readers, where it's like our struggles aren't with each other, with our like fellow individuals, not with our neighbors, not really. It's with like people and organizations and power that would benefit from like our conflicts with each other, but would like kind of get turned on its head a little if we turn our conflicts towards them, such as the kids turn their conflict towards the circus itself.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, I think you hit it on the head there. Systems, and I really love how that was depicted because it felt so momentous to see, like, this is what's actually happening, and to have that discovery illustrated before us. It was a truly, truly beautiful way of depicting that that's exactly the issue. So thank you so much, Jade. I really appreciate it. Adrienne, would you like to close us out with your thoughts?
I mean, Jade hits the nail on the head. It's an allegory for systemic oppression. It's a situation where even if we're comfortable in our own lives, that doesn't mean everyone else is. And it's worth joining together to fight for other people, because ultimately society works best if we are supporting each other. And it's something obviously I'm very passionate about. I know Jay's very passionate about, and I think we came together really well on that message. And also, once again, being able to use the circus as the society, as the allegory, it worked so bizarrely well when I realized, oh, the flea, because you have a flea circus, but fleas also, suck the blood. They sort of, of everybody around them. So the idea that our sorry, spoiler alert, that our nemesis being the circus and the circus is the flea is, it worked really nicely. But yeah, it's honestly what everyone is talking about. I'm just wildly in love with all of you. Like everything everyone's saying, it brings me like the heart, everything everyone's saying. It's about systems, it's about fighting within yourself, it's about finding each other and finding ourselves. And I think we all have that in common. And yeah.
Yeah, what better way to end it? And yes, just throwing in that last bit again, remembering the joy in it all, because what are they fighting for? in all of these stories, what are they trying to come out at the end of it with? And it's those connections, that joy, that happiness of being part of a loving unit and hopefully society, whatever those units may be, friends, family, all of it goes together. So thank you everyone so much. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to all the librarians and educators for joining us today. Next, we're going to have the final session of the day, which is the closing keynote with Raymond Santana. We're going to end this session, if you're all okay with this, with deep gratitude to Dr. Carla Hayden and her many years of service in the Library of Congress. She unfortunately was removed from that position recently. So my ask of everyone is let's continue to try to find our ways to make a difference in our communities because it all matters. Thank you so much. Have a great day.